In 1230, an entire civilization disappeared from the face of Europe. Not slowly, not quietly, and not by accident. One day they were here, with their gods, their language, their sacred forests that had stood for 1,000 years. And then they were gone. Replaced. Overwritten. Deleted. And the people responsible did not hide what they did. They celebrated it. They called it holy. And for the next 800 years, almost nobody asked a single question about it. What you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a myth. Every name, every date, every detail in this video is documented, buried in records that most people never think to look for. And by the time this video is over, you are going to understand exactly how an entire people was erased, who gave the order, who carried it out, and most importantly, why the world was never supposed to know. Keep watching, because the answer to that last question is the most disturbing part of all. Picture Europe around the year 1000. Christianity is spreading like a flood, across France, across Germany, across Poland and Spain and England. Every kingdom that was not already Christian was either converting or being pressured to. The map of belief was being redrawn in real time. But on the cold, amber-rich coast of the Baltic Sea, something extraordinary was happening. One people was refusing, not negotiating, not delaying, refusing. They were called the Old Prussians. Not the Prussians from your history textbook. Those came centuries later. These were the original people of that land. Indigenous, ancient, and living by a spiritual tradition so deep, so rooted, so old that it made Christianity look like a newcomer. Their priests tended sacred fires that were never allowed to go out. They performed rituals in groves of oak trees that had been considered holy for longer than Rome had existed. Their gods controlled the sky, the harvest, the sea. And for 200 years, 2 full centuries, every Christian missionary who came to convert them either failed or died trying. 200 years. Let that number sit with you for a moment, because that kind of resistance does not come from stubbornness. It comes from a people who genuinely believe in what they are protecting. Then came the year 1226, and everything changed. But here is the part that will make your stomach drop. The destruction of the Old Prussians did not begin with an invasion. It began with an invitation. A Polish duke named Conrad of Masovia was having trouble with Old Prussian raids on his border. His armies could not stop them. So he made a decision that history should never forgive him for. He invited the Teutonic Knights onto his land. He handed them territory. He handed them authority. And he handed them a problem he wanted someone else to solve. The Teutonic Knights were a crusading military order that had spent decades fighting in the Holy Land. Disciplined, ruthless, battle-hardened, and looking for a new mission now that the Crusades in Jerusalem were failing. Conrad gave them one. A neighbor opened the door and let the wolves in. And the wolves had been hungry for a long time. But even the Teutonic Knights needed something the Polish duke could not give them. They needed permission that came from a higher authority than any king or duke. They needed the one thing that could turn a military campaign into something untouchable, something unquestionable, something the entire Christian world would have to support. They needed the Pope. And the Pope gave it to them. He declared the campaign against the Old Prussians a crusade. Read that sentence again. A crusade. The same sacred word that sent armies to Jerusalem. The same moral authority that promised soldiers forgiveness for their sins if they fought and died. Now pointed not at foreign enemies across the sea, but at farmers and fishermen and priests living in the forests of Europe. People who had never attacked the church. People who had never threatened Rome. People whose only crime, their only crime, was that they refused to pray to someone else's God. What the Teutonic Knights did next was not a war. War's end. What they did was a process. Systematic and deliberate and patient. Villages were burned. Sacred groves that had been tended for centuries were cut to the ground and replaced with churches built from the same wood. Prussian priests were executed publicly so that everyone nearby would understand what was coming. Children were taken from their families and placed in Christian households where they would grow up with different names, speaking a different language, praying to a different God, with no memory of where they came from. And when the military work was finished, German colonists were moved in to fill the land. New names were given to rivers, to hills, to entire regions. The physical world that the Old Prussians had named and known and loved was renamed so thoroughly that eventually no one would even be able to point at a map and say, "Here, this is where they lived." By the late 1300s, the Old Prussian language, a language that had existed for thousands of years, was spoken by fewer than 100 people. 100 human beings carrying an entire civilization on their tongues. And every single year, that number got smaller. Parents dying without passing it on. Children who had been taken away, now adults who had forgotten. The language had survived ice ages. It had survived migrations. It had survived centuries of pressure from the growing Christian world. And then, sometime around the year 1700, the last known fluent speaker died. We do not know their name. We do not know if they died surrounded by people or completely alone. We only know that when they took their final breath, a world that had existed for thousands of years went silent. Not because of time. Not because of nature. Because someone decided it should. The history books have a word for what happened to the Old Prussians. They call it the Christianization of the Baltic. That is a remarkable word. Christianization. It sounds gentle. It sounds gradual. It sounds like something that simply happened like weather. It does not sound like crusades. It does not sound like children being taken. It does not sound like the last speaker of an ancient language dying alone while a civilization of colonists lived on the land his ancestors had named. The people who chose that word were the same people who built the churches, ran the universities, and decided what future generations would be taught. They were the winners. And the winners did not choose a word that would make anyone ask questions. But here is what they could not erase. They could not erase the fact that the Old Prussians resisted for over 200 years. They could not erase the fact that even after the crusade began, there were uprisings that lasted decades. People who kept fighting long after any rational calculation said the fight was over. They could not erase the amber still resting in Baltic soil that Prussian hands once touched. And they could not erase the truth that when an entire Christian world came for these people and offered them a simple choice, convert or be destroyed, they chose who they were. They chose their gods, their language, their identity, over their survival. And that is not a tragedy. That is the most human thing I have ever read in a history book. Every civilization that was erased deserved someone to say their name out loud. The Old Prussians existed. They resisted. They were destroyed by people who called it holy. And somewhere in the ground of the Baltic coast, the memory of who they were is still waiting. If this story made you feel something, if there is another buried people, another hidden history, another name the world was told to forget, leave it in the comments. I read every single one.